Hello everyone, I'm Aliyah and welcome to Crash CSS. Today marks the beginning of our gender studies course with the most important and foundational topic of the entire syllabus, which is the introduction to gender studies. This topic is not just the first chapter of the book, but the intellectual backbone of the entire subject. Without understanding this properly, it becomes extremely difficult to write conceptually strong and high-scoring answers in the CSS examination. Gender studies helps us understand how identity, society, culture, relationships, institutions, and power structures operate through the lens of gender. It allows us to examine how social roles are created, how inequalities emerge, and how these patterns affect the lives of individuals and groups within society. At its core, gender studies is an interdisciplinary field of knowledge that explores how societies define masculinity, femininity, and other gender identities, and how these definitions shape access to resources, authority, opportunities, and rights. It examines how gender influences family life, education, health, employment, politics, law, media, and even religion. More importantly, it teaches us that gender is not simply a personal trait, but a powerful social system that structures our everyday life. It shows us how deeply gender is embedded in traditions, customs, laws, and institutional practices. In the Pakistani context, the importance of gender studies becomes even more evident. Pakistani society is shaped by strong cultural traditions, religious interpretations, kinship systems, and social norms that deeply influence gender behavior. From early childhood, boys and girls are treated differently, raised differently, and prepared for different social roles. Boys are often socialized to become assertive, independent, and financially responsible, while girls are encouraged to be modest, obedient, caring, and family-oriented. These expectations shape educational choices, career paths, marriage patterns, and leadership opportunities. Gender studies helps us question whether these socially assigned roles are natural or simply learned through generations of social practice. This introductory lecture will give you a clear roadmap of the entire discipline. We will explore what gender actually means, how gender studies emerged as an academic field, how it differs from women's studies, what key debates shaped its development, and how the discipline evolved in Pakistan. By the end of this lecture, you will have the conceptual clarity required to understand advanced themes such as patriarchy, feminism, gender inequality, social construction, empowerment, and intersectionality. This clarity is what enables candidates to move from descriptive answers to analytical and critical responses in the CSS exam. Gender studies is not only an academic subject for examination purposes, it is also a powerful intellectual tool for future policymakers, administrators, diplomats, and development practitioners. It trains you to view social problems through a deeper, evidence-based lens and helps you design inclusive and equitable solutions. Whether you work in governance, education, law, health, or social policy, understanding gender dynamics will significantly improve the quality of your decision-making. This lecture is therefore not just the start of a syllabus, but the beginning of a more informed, critical, and socially responsible way of thinking. A proper understanding of gender studies begins with one of its most fundamental distinctions, which is the difference between sex and gender. Many misunderstandings about this subject arise because people use these two terms interchangeably, even though they represent two very different concepts. Sex refers to the biological and physical differences between male and female bodies. These differences include chromosomes, hormonal structures, reproductive organs, and anatomical features. Sex is assigned at birth based on biological characteristics, and for a long time it was assumed that these biological differences naturally determined how men and women should behave in society. Gender, however, is not biological. Gender is a social and cultural construction. It refers to the roles, behaviors, responsibilities, expectations, and identities that society attaches to individuals based on their perceived sex. In simple words, sex is about the body, while gender is about the meaning that society attaches to that body. Gender tells people how to dress, how to speak, how to behave, what career to choose, how to express emotions, and how to interact with others. These rules are not created by biology, but by culture, tradition, religion, and social institutions. In Pakistani society, this distinction becomes very visible in everyday life. From childhood, boys and girls are treated differently. Boys are often encouraged to be confident, independent, assertive, and financially responsible. Girls, on the other hand, are encouraged to be obedient, modest, caring, and family-oriented. These traits are not inherited through biology. A baby girl is not born with modesty, and a baby boy is not born with leadership skills. These qualities are taught through family upbringing, school practices, media representation, and social interaction. This process is known as gender socialization. Gender roles also change across time and cultures, which further proves that gender is not natural or fixed. There was a time in many societies when women were not allowed to vote, receive higher education, or work outside the home. Today, in many parts of the world, women are astronauts, judges, heads of state, and military officers. If gender were purely biological, such changes would not be possible. These transformations show that gender roles are flexible and socially produced. This distinction between sex and gender is the intellectual foundation of gender studies. Once we accept that gender is socially constructed, we can begin to question why certain roles are linked to men and others to women, why power is unequally distributed, and why inequality persists even when laws guarantee equality. For CSS students, this concept is extremely important because it repeatedly appears in short notes, theoretical questions, and analytical essays. A strong answer always clearly separates biology from social construction and applies the concept to Pakistani society. Gender studies did not emerge suddenly as a fully developed academic discipline. Its roots lie in the global feminist movements that gained strength during the 1960s and 1970s. During this period, women across Europe and North America began questioning their social, political, and economic marginalization. At the same time, scholars began to realize that mainstream academic knowledge was heavily male-centered. History books focused on male leaders, political movements were narrated through men's experiences, and economic theories ignored women's unpaid labor inside the home. To correct this intellectual imbalance, universities began to establish women's studies programs. These programs aimed to make women visible in knowledge production. They studied women's history, women's social status, women's legal rights, women's labor, women's health, and women's political participation. Women's studies challenged the idea that knowledge was neutral and showed that what had been presented as universal truth was actually shaped by male experiences and male interests. This was a major intellectual breakthrough. However, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, scholars began to recognize that focusing only on women created its own limitations. Gender relations involve both women and men, and power operates through relationships, institutions, and cultural expectations that affect all genders. Moreover, the lived experiences of transgender and gender-diverse individuals had been completely ignored in earlier frameworks. Scholars realized that studying only women did not fully explain how gender operates as a complete social system. As a result, women's studies gradually expanded into what is now known as gender studies. This shift marked an important conceptual transformation. Instead of concentrating only on women's oppression, scholars began examining how masculinity and femininity are constructed, how male dominance is maintained through institutions, how men are also shaped and restricted by gender norms, and how non-binary identities challenge traditional gender categories. Gender studies thus became a more inclusive, analytical, and comparative discipline. This transformation also shifted the focus from only advocacy to deeper structural analysis. Gender studies began to study how power operates in families, education, law, economy, state institutions, and media. It also began to explore how gender interacts with class, race, ethnicity, religion, and region. This expansion made gender studies one of the most dynamic fields in the social sciences today. For CSS aspirants, the evolution of gender studies is a highly examinable topic. Examiners often expect candidates to trace the journey from feminist movements to women's studies and then to gender studies, explaining why this shift was necessary. High-scoring answers show that women's studies laid the foundation by highlighting women's exclusion, while gender studies broadened the lens by analyzing gender as a complete social system. Gender studies has one of the broadest scopes among all the social science disciplines because gender influences nearly every aspect of human life. It is not limited to the study of men and women alone, but examines how gender as a system shapes personal identities, social roles, institutional practices, and power relations across society. It is a multidisciplinary field that draws knowledge from sociology, anthropology, history, psychology, economics, political science, law, and literature. At the heart of gender studies is the idea that gender roles are socially constructed rather than naturally determined. It examines how societies define what is considered masculine and feminine, how these definitions change over time, and how they vary across cultures. It also studies how these definitions shape everyday life, from family responsibilities and career choices to political participation and access to justice. Another major area of focus is power and patriarchy. Patriarchy refers to a system in which men hold more power than women in most social institutions. Gender studies examines how patriarchy operates through laws, customs, economic structures, religious interpretations, and cultural traditions. It also explores how patriarchy affects not only women, but also men, by placing rigid expectations of strength, control, and emotional restraint upon them. Gender studies also focuses on gender identity and expression. It studies how individuals experience their gender in different ways and how transgender and non-binary identities challenge traditional binary understandings of male and female. This aspect of the field has become increasingly important in contemporary debates on human rights, legal recognition, and social inclusion. A key analytical tool used in gender studies is intersectionality. This concept explains that gender does not operate alone. It intersects with class, ethnicity, religion, region, disability, and age. For example, a poor rural woman faces very different challenges compared to an urban educated woman, and both face different realities from a transgender person. Gender studies helps us understand these layered inequalities, rather than viewing all women or all men as experiencing the same conditions. Gender studies also plays a major role in development and public policy. It analyzes how policies in education, health, employment, and governance affect men and women differently. It helps policymakers design gender-sensitive and inclusive policies. For CSS students, understanding the scope of gender studies is crucial because it allows them to apply gender analysis across multiple subjects such as sociology, Pakistan affairs, governance, and current affairs. Women's studies and gender studies are closely related, but they are not the same discipline. Women's studies emerged first as a response to the historical exclusion of women from knowledge, power, and public life. For centuries, women's experiences were ignored in history, literature, politics, and economics. Women's studies was created to make women visible and to document their struggles, achievements, and social position. The central purpose of women's studies is to study women specifically. It focuses on women's oppression, women's labor, women's education, women's health, women's political participation, and women's legal rights. It is closely connected to feminist movements that aim to challenge patriarchy and promote women's empowerment. In this sense, women's studies is both an academic and a political project aimed at social change. Gender studies, on the other hand, developed later as an expansion of women's studies. Scholars realized that gender is not only about women, it is a system of relationships, power structures, and social expectations that involve men, women, and gender-diverse individuals. Gender studies studies masculinity as well as femininity, male privilege as well as female subordination, and the experiences of transgender and non-binary people as well. While women's studies is centered on women, gender studies is centered on gender as a social system. It does not treat women as the only subjects of analysis, but examines how gender operates across family, education, economy, media, law, religion, and politics. It studies how power is distributed between genders and how these power relations are maintained through institutions and culture. For CSS students, this distinction is extremely important because it is frequently tested. A strong answer always explains that women's studies laid the foundation by highlighting women's exclusion and oppression, while gender studies broadened the scope by analyzing the complete structure of gender relations. Gender studies is more analytical and comparative, while women's studies is more advocacy-oriented and women-centered. Gender studies is a multidisciplinary field, meaning that it does not belong to a single academic discipline. Instead, it draws knowledge from multiple fields to provide a deeper and more complete understanding of gender in society. This multidisciplinary nature is one of the greatest strengths of gender studies because gender itself affects every area of life. From sociology, gender studies learns how families, schools, religion, and media shape gender roles and expectations. Sociology helps explain how social institutions socialize individuals into masculine and feminine roles and how these roles become part of everyday life. From anthropology, gender studies gains insights into how different cultures understand gender differently. What is considered appropriate behavior for men and women in one society may be completely different in another. From psychology, gender studies examines how gender identity develops, how children internalize gender roles, and how rigid gender expectations affect mental health. From economics, it studies wage gaps, labor force participation, unpaid domestic work, poverty, and economic inequality between men and women. It reveals how women's unpaid labor inside the home contributes significantly to the economy but remains unrecognized. From political science and law, gender studies analyzes political representation, voting behavior, leadership opportunities, laws related to marriage, inheritance, violence, and workplace rights. It also studies how public policies affect men and women differently. From history, it documents how gender roles have changed over time and how past structures continue to affect present realities. Because of this multidisciplinary approach, gender studies provides a much richer and more holistic understanding of society than any single discipline could offer. It allows students to connect personal experiences with larger social structures. For CSS aspirants, this multidisciplinary nature is highly valuable because it strengthens analytical skills across multiple subjects and enhances their ability to link gender with governance, policymaking, and social development. One of the most important theoretical debates in gender studies is the autonomy versus integration debate. This debate revolves around the question of whether gender studies should remain a separate academic discipline or be fully integrated into all other subjects. The autonomy perspective argues that gender studies should remain independent. Supporters of this view believe that mainstream academic disciplines have historically been male-dominated and often ignore or distort gender issues. They argue that an independent space is necessary for feminist scholarship to grow freely, challenge patriarchal knowledge, and develop new theories without being overshadowed by traditional academic structures. According to this view, if gender studies is absorbed into other disciplines, its critical edge may be weakened. The integration perspective, on the other hand, argues that gender should not remain confined to one department. Supporters of integration believe that gender is relevant to all fields, including history, economics, sociology, political science, and even natural sciences. They argue that gender should be mainstreamed so that every discipline becomes gender-sensitive. Their goal is to make gender a universal analytical category rather than a specialized niche subject. Most universities today follow a blended approach. They maintain gender studies as a separate department while also incorporating gender perspectives into other subjects. This approach allows the field to retain its independence while also influencing mainstream academic knowledge. For CSS students, Understanding this debate shows intellectual maturity and helps in answering theoretical questions with depth. Gender studies in Pakistan began to develop formally in the late 1980s. This period marked the establishment of women's studies centers in major universities such as Karachi University, Punjab University, and Quaid-e-Azam University. These centers introduced postgraduate programs, conducted research, and organized training on women's issues, legal rights, and social status. Their main objective was to highlight women's problems and promote gender equality in a society deeply shaped by patriarchal traditions. Alongside academic institutions, civil society organizations and activists also played a crucial role in shaping the field. Women's rights organizations highlighted issues such as domestic violence, honor killings, political participation, education, health, and employment. These efforts gradually created space for gender discourse in policymaking and public debate. In the early years, the curriculum of gender studies in Pakistan relied heavily on Western literature because local scholarship was limited. Most theories and frameworks were borrowed from Europe and North America. Over time, Pakistani scholars began producing local research that reflected indigenous realities, cultural complexities, and religious contexts. This localization of knowledge made the discipline more relevant to Pakistani society. Today, gender studies is taught in several universities at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. However, it is still considered a developing field compared to traditional disciplines. Despite this, it has made significant contributions to understanding social inequality, law reforms, development policy, and governance in Pakistan. Gender studies in Pakistan has faced many challenges due to cultural, ideological, institutional, and political factors. One of the major challenges is the widespread perception that gender studies is a Western or anti-cultural subject. Many people believe that it promotes ideas that are incompatible with local traditions and religious values. This misunderstanding creates resistance at both social and institutional levels. Patriarchy and conservative attitudes also create strong barriers. Discussions on gender inequality, women's rights, and transgender identities often face backlash from conservative segments of society. In some cases, even academic institutions hesitate to fully support the discipline due to fear of controversy. Another major challenge is limited funding and institutional support. Social science disciplines in Pakistan generally receive less funding compared to science and technology. Gender studies departments often face shortages of trained faculty, research grants, and academic resources. There is also limited public awareness about what gender studies actually is, which affects student enrollment and career prospects. Despite these challenges, gender studies continues to survive and grow because social realities constantly demand its existence. The persistence of violence against women, economic inequality, and social exclusion proves that gender analysis is not a luxury but a necessity for national development. Despite facing many challenges, gender studies has made significant progress in Pakistan over the past 3 decades. More universities now offer degree programs in gender studies and women's studies. Research output on issues such as domestic violence, honor killings, education gaps, labor force participation, and transgender rights has increased. These studies have contributed to public awareness and policy debates. Civil society organizations frequently collaborate with academic institutions to design gender-sensitive projects, conduct field research, and influence legislation. Legal reforms related to women's protection, workplace harassment, inheritance rights, and transgender recognition reflect the growing impact of gender discourse on state policy. Public awareness on gender issues has also increased through media campaigns, social movements, and youth activism. Issues that were once considered taboo are now openly discussed in public spaces. This indicates a gradual shift in social attitudes. For CSS students and future civil servants, the significance of gender studies is immense. It provides the analytical tools needed to understand social change, governance challenges, and policy failures. It prepares policymakers to design inclusive, equitable, and evidence-based solutions. Gender studies is therefore not only an academic subject, but a practical instrument for national development, social justice, and human rights in Pakistan. Thank you for watching this introductory lecture on gender studies. This topic is the foundation of the entire course, and every important concept you will study ahead is built upon this understanding. In the upcoming videos, we will explore deeper theories, key debates, and real CSS exam applications that will strengthen your preparation. If you found this lecture helpful, make sure to subscribe to Crash CSS, press the bell icon so you never miss an update, and stay connected with the full course. Your serious CSS preparation starts here. I will see you in the next lecture.